Everyone, salam, namaste, adab, and welcome to today's event. We are going to hear a very famous public figure as well as a well-known academician, Professor Harbans Mukhia, formerly Professor of Medieval History and Rector of Jawaharlal Nehru University. He has written many books. You can read on the poster. And the title today is The Past and Present of Indian History, Pre- and Post-Independence. He will be introduced by Professor Farhat Nasreen, who is the head of Department of History and Culture at Jamia. And the concluding remarks will be given by Professor Bodh Prakash, who was a professor at, if correct me, whether it was a Ashoka or some other university in Delhi. Sorry for that. He's an author, well-known person in the partition literature. So let's start with Professor Farhat Nasreen. Welcome you all. Ji Farhat.
Hi, good evening, everybody. Thank you, Raziuddin Saab, for this opportunity. Well, introducing and beginning a program, which is where you have a talk by Professor Harbans Mukhia, is both easy and difficult. It's very easy because everyone knows Professor Mukhia, so I don't need to try too hard to establish his scholarship and prove his scholarship here. Everybody knows him very well. Difficult because it is like kind of containing, जिसको हम लोग कहते हैं कि सूरज को दिया दिखाने की तरह है सर के बारे में कुछ भी यहाँ पर कहना. But there are a couple of things that I would like to say about him. एक तो ये कि जहाँ जहाँ पे हिस्ट्री में गैप्स होते हैं, बहुत सारी जगहों पर गैप्स होते हैं, तो वहाँ पर सर प्रोफेसर हरबंस मुखिया वुड बिकम रफूगर. वहां पे ये रफूगर बन जाते हैं और उन गैप्स को जो है ये जल्दी जल्दी सी के भर देते हैं. और इनकी ये जो एक किताब है हिस्टोरियंस एंड हिस्ट्री ड्यूरिंग द रेन ऑफ अकबर, इट्स typically a work of beautiful rafugari, because there is so much that we did not know about not just the text but also the historians. So in that book you get a very holistic kind of a picture of who the historians were, what they were doing, what was their family background, what is there in the books, and it's also concise, beautifully done, absolutely amazing, loved by all the students, used by all the teachers, incredibly lovely work. Then the other thing that he has, the other quality that I would like to talk about is that जहाँ पे भी कोई भी complicated concept को समझना होता है, वहाँ पे प्रोफेसर मुखिया जादूगर बन जाते हैं. Because if you have to talk about continuity and change, if you have to say कि continuity में भी continuity नहीं है या change में भी change नहीं है, तो कैसे continuity में continuity नहीं है या change में change नहीं है? If you ask him, he is going to make it so simple for you to understand. And there are people who might have read history books for ages, but they might be simply clueless about the basic concepts of dealing with history and the complexities therein. So Professor Mukhia himself, a extremely learned scholar, can make it simple for everybody. And that kind of accounts for his popularity. The third thing that I would like to say about him, कि ये सौदागर भी हैं. सौदागर इस तरह से हैं ये कि he has invested in the young and poor scholars like me. He invests in encouraging the people who are trying to deal with history, trying to read history, write history. They are his investment now. He invests in people like us. He's invested in the subject of history. So he is basically trying to ensure that history as a discipline always remains a package of truthfulness, that it never lies, and the historians keep striving to tell the truth to the world. I know a bit about him personally, and I just cannot stop myself but to say this, that Professor Mukhia and humility and humanism, वो आपस में इस तरह से मिले हुए हैं जैसे इतर में हवा मिली हुई हो, जिसको आप अलग ही नहीं कर सकते. तो सर में जितनी इंसानियत है और जो ह्यूमैनिज्म है उनके अंदर, वो वाकई इत्र में हवा की तरह या फूलों के रंग की तरह आप उसको अलग कर ही नहीं सकते. And with this, I just invite you and I welcome you to listen to Professor Mukhia, amazing, skillful, popular, incredible historian. And I'm fortunate to be here with you and talking to you and inviting him today and welcoming him today. Thank you so much, sir.
Sir, unmute yourself. Yeah. Unmute yourself. आप अपने को unmute कर लें. जी.
जी हो गया जी.
जी.
First of all, thank you very much, Razi Sahab, for inviting me to this discussion and being introduced by Professor Farhat Nasreen is I mean, I discovered three or four qualities in me which were unknown to me, and to that I am a Rafugar and a Jadugar and so on. Well, thank you very much. It's really generous of you, very, very generous of you to think so kindly of me. I have sort of, traversed the path of history almost by accident, and I've been traversing there is a saying in Urdu, Gul Muhammad ऊंट बैठाते बैठाते ऊंट अच्छा बैठाने लगे. So I think that could be said of me. History लिखते लिखते थोड़ी अच्छी लिखने लगे, but that's all one can say about me. But anyway, thank you very much for being so generous. Let me come to, I'm told I have about 40 to 45 minutes, and I'll try to keep to that limit. Well, first of all, let me say that the discipline of history that we know today, although historians have this tall claim history is the oldest discipline, and it began with Herodotus and so on and so forth, 27 years history and so on and so forth. But history as a discipline is really about 300, 400 years old. It's really, in fact, it came into its full shape in the 19th century. Prior to that, it was still evolving as a discipline. And having evolved in the 19th century as a discipline, it became universal. We'll come to that in a moment. So history, as we know today, with all the tall claims of historians, it is actually a very young discipline. In fact, all the social sciences disciplines, or rather even other disciplines, don't have more than 300 or 400 years of history behind them. So history is a 19th century discipline. Now, let's also right at the outset understand that there are certain distinctions between history and memory, for example, or history and perceptions of the past, for example. History goes by certain norms, the evidence, the authenticity of evidence, the checking of its location, provenance, etc., etc., its logic, and so on and so forth. Whereas perceptions of the past and memory, they also persist in history. They also, in a way, formulate our history, help us to formulate our understanding of history by persisting along with the profession, persisting this memory of the past in various forms, and perceptions of the past, they keep on persisting along with it. So we have to take these memory and perceptions of the past along with history in order to understand the discipline as such. Now, I said history is essentially 19th century discipline, evolved in the 19th century. Prior to that, there were perceptions of the past everywhere. In every society, there were various kinds of perceptions and even reconstructions of the past. They were sort of very diverse, as one can understand. there were no certain given rules that they followed. Each one followed its own. They were diverse and discrete. Each one had its own sort of traditions and conventions to go by, to remember the past or to reconstruct the past. So there was a great deal of diversity of perceptions of the past in all societies. But it began to evolve towards the discipline of history, as we understand it now, towards the discipline of history in Europe from the 16th, 17th century onwards, when notions of, trying to find a proof for your statement, trying to authenticate your observation or statement about the past. This wasn't the case earlier. In fact, earlier on, if you go back to Herodotus, it's always good to go back to Herodotus. Herodotus writes, he writes not history, but histories in the plural. And secondly, he says that his collection is collection of tales and traditions. He almost asserts that, these are tales and traditions. There is no proof required. There is no proof for these, and there is no proof required. So take my word for it. Now, this taking my word for it continued right into the medieval period of European history, where a certain kind of transformation took place. A transformation, once again, not proof, etc., but one kind of transformation, twofold transformation. One was that once God's will became the causal explanation of history. History is the unfolding of God's will, coming with medieval church, particularly Augustine. History is being the unfolding of God's will. History becomes a universal phenomenon. It's not the history of India and China and Europe, etc., etc. It is history of one universe, which is what God has created. And this whole history of one universe as a whole, as a single pattern, follows a single pattern, unfolds as a single pattern, rather than what looks like haphazard and diverse to us actually is a single pattern, because in God's will, nothing happens that is haphazard. Nothing happens that is, accidental. Everything is part of a pattern which has happened in the past, which is happening today, and which will happen. God knows everything, past, present, and future. We don't know, but God, we know that what has happened and what's happening and what will happen is part of God's will, and therefore it forms the whole universal past or universal present forms a single pattern. So history as a single whole, rather than diverse history of the diverse regions, that came to be, even when regions were studied as a part of this whole, nonetheless, the concept was that history is one single whole of the whole universe. And God's will is the causal explanation of this single whole. Now, this began to change once again. I have to run very quickly through it. 16th century onwards, a notion of finding proof for your statement began to emerge. For various reasons, it began to emerge. First, the question of language became important. Many different meanings of language, particularly in the context of Roman law. The meanings of language had to be were contested, and therefore different understandings, different interpretations came to evolve. And therefore, one had to not merely make the statement and accept it because it has been made by a very eminent, reliable person, but you have to find proof for it. And the proof you have to find from what was beginning to grow as archives, family archives, regional state archives, etc., etc. So that archives gave a fillip to the providing of proofs for your statement. But the real break also came in the late 17th century, starting from 16th century. It came with periodization of history, ancient, medieval, and modern. It started with a history of theology, Christian theology, but really soon spread to the rest of society and became a, historical phenomenon, ancient, medieval, and modern periods of Indian history. That becomes a crucial and very, very durable durable development which took place in the 17th century. It was formulated formally in 1688. But it was evolving earlier, but formally it came into being towards the end of the 17th century. Now, this is the very quick review of developments of history as a discipline in Europe. And that's the most important region, because that's where it's from there and the reasons from which relate to Europe that it became a universal discipline as we practice it today. Now, in other regions, India, for example, very quickly, India, for example, there was a great mix of various, what shall I say, resources or sources or resources for the formulation or for the understanding of the past. The sources were religious texts, epics, mythologies, inscriptions, coins, and later on archaeology, and so on and so forth. So all of these gave very, very diverse, not one single picture of India as a whole. India as a whole itself was a very, very dubious concept early in ancient India or medieval India. But anyway, there was not one single reconstruction of India's past. There were various reconstructions of India's past. But strangely enough, very interestingly enough, there is one region where some kind of the notion of the history as a discipline was developing, had developed, and that's the Arabic Islamic region. Interesting because is in a way the notion of history, of the notion of reconstruction of the past is the youngest notion in the Arab Islamic world, because it came to this region with the coming of Islam. Prior to that, there was no history as such. Some dynastic history, not even dynastic, family history and so on, but no history as such as we understand it, or even as it was understood. But with the coming of Islam, the notion of history proper began to develop. And I'm saying proper because the question is an early degree of authenticating the evidence, authenticating, the statements made by historians. That some notions had developed, and the strongest notion was chronology, very strict adherence to chronology. Now, chronology itself is a very sort of strong source of authentication of an event. This event took place in this year, in this month, in this place, on this day, etc., etc. That itself is very strong sort of source of authentication of an event. But others also, Isnad and so on, but Isnad was related mainly to more to theological history than history outside theology. But nonetheless, the notion of Isnad was there. That is to say, you pick up a piece of history or piece of information, and you check where did this piece of information came to you from. And then you go to that second source from which the piece of information had gone to your informant, and then ask him or her, where did he or she get this information from, until you reach the original source of. But as I said, this is more to do with theology, particularly with the hadiths, rather than of history, but the notion of authenticating was there. So some notion of authenticating history was there. But having established its connection with Islam, let me say that it still didn't become a part of theology, Islamic theology, as history had become in medieval Europe. It didn't become a part of theology because it did not have the two characteristics that medieval European history had, namely that history was not narrated as one single pattern, universal pattern, or even pattern in a particular region, or even Islamic world or any other part of region. History was, on the contrary, narrated as, particularly in the Mongol, Persian, and Indian context, it was narrated as collection of individual events, each individual event forming one unit, independent of other units. So there was no question of pattern, one single pattern in which history was evolving and unfolding itself. And B, that historical causation was attributed to human will rather than God's will. God was invoked once in a while, but human will, such and such a ruler was a very powerful ruler, so he went and conquered so much of territory. Such and such a ruler was very religious-minded ruler, so he was very very dogmatic about imposing or spreading his religion. Such a ruler was very liberal ruler, etc., etc. So history then, unlike Europe, where it is unfolding of God's will, in the Arab Muslim world, particularly in Persian, Mongol, Persian, and in Indian context, it became an unfolding of ruler's will. Ruler is the pivot of all history. All history is written around the court about the ruling class, ruling dynasty, ruling ruler, and so on and so forth. So the pivot is the king, and all events that take place during his reign are the unfolding of his personality rather than of God's personality. So even though it was very closely connected to Islam, it still didn't become part of Islamic theology. Okay, so we have these diverse, I mean, I just took up two examples, one could take up many other examples. But this was how we have three kinds of developments. One was in Europe, one was in India, which was very diverse, and the third was in the Arab Islamic world. And there were others, China and Japan, and so on. I can't go into that at the moment. Now, 19th century witnesses a very clean break from history, from the diversity, from diversities of history, the regional diversities of history in India and Arab world and China and so on and so forth, It clean break because it established one universal form of history, one universal discipline of history. By now, by early 19th century, by 1820s, history had become a discipline with its own rigorous rules and regulations and norms and so on and so forth, particularly in Germany. It had been incorporated as a discipline in the University of Berlin. So it had become a discipline with very strict kind of adherence to periodization, ancient, medieval, and modern, and very strict kind of rules of history. Now, what happened then was that what Jack Goody has called, interestingly, the theft of history. What happened was that with European expansion to the rest of the world, and European expansion took place in the following arms and following trade and arms and politics and so on. In the footsteps of all of these, European concepts, intellectual concepts also followed in the regions where Europe had expanded itself, that is to say, to the rest of the world. And therefore, the diverse notions of history or diverse notions of the past that I was speaking of great diversity of these notions. All of these were absorbed. All of these were, in Jack Goody's words, stolen, or theft was committed, and therefore different notions of time. There was no notion of periodization, for example, in any of the, including in Europe prior to the 17th century, but certainly nowhere else, in no other part of the world, the periodization, ancient, medieval, or modern, any other kind of period, or any other kind of formal periodization. So that Europe's singular notion of history, and this singular notion of history was given particularly to us by Leopold von Ranke. Ranke gave a very swift, quick, definitive definition of history. History tells us as it really happened, as he says. This is in 5 words in German and 7 words in English. It sums up the notion of history that the history as a discipline came to inquire in the 19th century in Germany and Europe, and then in the rest of the world. History tells us as it really happened. Now, there are 2 emphases here. One is that it's not a historian who tells us, historians who tell us what really happened. It's history which tells us what really happened. How does history tell us? How does history tell us, if not the historians, how does history tell us what really happened in the past? History tells us because by way of collecting all the facts of history, one by one, when all the facts of history would have been collected, and while collecting facts, don't judge them, don't sit in judgment over them, don't evaluate them, just go on collecting facts. And one day, when all the facts would have been collected, history will that day tell us in unambiguous terms, just like physics or chemistry or mathematics, history will tell us exactly what really happened. The second emphasis is really happened. There'll be no doubt about what really happened. It will be absolutely unambiguous what really, we would know absolutely unambiguously what really happened. So history became a science. It was called a science in the 19th century. In some places still called a science. There is a world conference, I think, of historical sciences, which meets once in 4 years. I think in France it's still called science. Anyway, irrespective of that, he did acquire the attributes of science, the clarity of clear-cut meaning of your data, unambiguous results from your data, and therefore history tells us as it really happened. Now, and periodization, ancient, medieval, and modern, came to the rest of the world. In Europe, it had come with certain implications, which implications changed, particularly when it came to India, or at least partly changed. The implications was that, in Europe, the notion of periodization arises not from ancient history and medieval history, but from modern history. First, Europe gives itself the image of rationality, modernity, rationality, progress, dynamism, and going on to science and technology and so on. So progress, the idea of progress began to develop based on rationality. So Europe was modern and rational in the modern age. Therefore, the medieval age became the dark age of irrationality and superstition and religion and religiosity and so on and so forth. And therefore, medieval is defined not on its own terms, but in terms of what it was not. Medieval was unmodern. That's what medieval was. Therefore, medieval is backward, medieval is dark, and so on. Ancient, of course, was still bright because Europe was, modeling itself, its modernity on the ancient rationality and so on, ancient Greco-Roman rationality and so on. But medieval was dark, is the other of modern, as it were. Now, this was how the tripartite division of historical time was constituted in Europe in the modern times, in the early modern times. In India, to India, it came with another distortion, and namely that it didn't come as ancient, medieval, and modern. It came as Hindu period, Muslim period, and British period. So that the Hindu period was bad, of course. James Mill had, being a utilitarian, he had utter contempt for all religions. For Islam, yes, but even more than Islam, he had it for Hinduism. He gave it all kinds of very nasty names and so on. But the idea was that, since British period, the modern period, the British period has brought rationality. The medieval period is therefore not only it's dark, of course, like in Europe, but it's dark because it's a Muslim period. It's identified with the Muslim identity. So it's dark as well as Muslim, or it is Muslim, it is dark because it is Muslim. So that identity of a religious identity came to be attached, which wasn't the case in Europe. Religious identity came to be attached to the whole period, medieval period, and of course to ancient period, Hindu period, which was left behind by the British rationalism and modernity and so on and so forth. Now, for James Mill, Hindus and Muslims constituted two nations. This was his term. It's not Jinnah's term or Savarkar's term. It was James Mill in 1818, he coined this term, his book, History of British India, 1818. He coined this term. Hindus and Muslims are two nations, and they are hostile to each other, always constantly in conflict with each other. This is his description of India in the medieval period, Muslim period, as he called it. So that all history in his perspective came to be centered on religious or political dynastic history, where the driving force of history was the religious identity of the ruler or the dynasty, or both. So the driving force, the explanatory cause of history was the religion of the ruler, or the dynasty, and that, or whether it's Hindu or Muslim. So this twofold sort of enclosure of history to political dynastic history and to the explanation in terms of religious identity of the ruler, this became the norm. This is how the discipline of history came to India in the 19th century, and therefore prevailed since then, right up to the independence. It prevailed there because most history was written within this framework of political dynastic history, even by Indian historians, political dynastic history, where the ruler, the foundation of Muslim rule in India, ABM Habibullah's book, he's not emphasizing partly he's emphasizing Muslim rule, but he's also making, cautious statements contrary to the Muslim character of the Muslim rule, or R.P. Tripaঠি's some aspects of Muslim administration in India, so that Muslim remained the sort of the permanent presence, but within that, Indian historians, after in the 20th century, they began to make some amendments. They began to introduce some revisions of that. Very sort of not very major revisions, but nonetheless revisions. One was like in ancient Indian history, which was being denounced by James Mill and others. There were also some other Orientalists who also appreciated, but the dominant trend in history writing was these Orientalists were not historians, but the dominant trend in history writing was what James Mill had laid down and was carried on by others. So that while the James Mill kind of history denounced ancient Indian history as very sort of backward and poor and uncultured and uncouth and so on and so forth. Indian historians of ancient India began to bring glory to the history of India, glorify ancient Indian history as a counterpoint to the British colonial portrayal of ancient Indian history. Medieval Indian historians similarly, while for James Mill, Hindus and Muslims were nations which constantly at war with each other, the historians of medieval India, many of them illustrious historians, they brought in the aspect of composite culture, that there were also many adjustments, many compromises, many common spaces between the Hindus and Muslims, not merely antagonism and so on and so forth. So it's a complex story rather than a simple story of antagonism and so on and so forth. Now, but the periodization remained the same, not more or less, entirely remained the same, right? Even when its nomenclature changed to ancient, medieval and modern in 1903 to begin with, its basis remained the same, namely the Hindu period, the Muslim period, and the British period. That basis remained the same. And the explanation, both when you are talking in terms of Hindu or Muslim religion as the driving force, the analytical categories, religious category, religious identity of the rulers. That is the analytical category for understanding history, for analyzing Indian history. This analytical category, religion, still remains, even in the revised or somewhat modified version of history. Religious category still remain the analytical category of Indian history, whether ancient India or medieval India. So you have two phases, one like in the freedom struggle itself. This revisions came with the freedom struggle, as an assertion of Indian identity opposed to the or different from or even opposed to the colonial identity of India. So that and yet the freedom struggle had these two phases. The one represented by the so-called nationalism represented by the Congress, which comprised all religious identities, and the so-called communalism represented by Muslim League, which represented one religion against another religion. So that the religion still remained intact there as the analytical category of society and history and politics, current politics. Religion remained the category. So except that Congress, its nationalism, assertion of nationalism said, we Hindus will remain Hindus and Muslims will remain Muslims and so on and so forth, but come together to fight against the British. And the Jinnah's Muslim League said, Muslims and Hindus cannot remain together. They are separate nations. They have to be separated. But the category, as you can see, still remains religious category for the analysis of their society and their politics and their history and so on and so forth. But nonetheless, some revisions were introduced. Now, the post-independence, very radical and very rapid transformation of, or rather decolonization of history writing took place, very, very rapid. The first great assault on this on the colonial history writing was done by Marxist historians, 3 or 4 great Marxist historians. One of them is still alive, well, fortunately, amongst us, Irfan Habib. From the mid-1950s, when 1956, D.D. Koshambi's book, An Introduction to the An Introduction to the Study of Indian History was published, to 1963, when Irfan Habib's book, Agrarian System of Mughal India was published, to 1965, when S.R.R.S. Sharma's book, Indian Feudalism was published. What these books, I have several differences with these and with R.S. Sharma's Indian Feudalism in particular, but which have been put on record. But I'm not. I nonetheless admire that a new category of analysis was substituted for the old category of analysis. Class was substituted for community as the category of analysis of Indian history, as the tool of analysis of Indian history. And therefore, class became the sort of the new tool of analysis, new mode of analysis of Indian history. And this completely overwhelmed as actually, or not completely overwhelmed, greatly influenced the writing of Indian history from the late 1950s, 60s, 70s, and so on, which the whole thematic revolution, as it were, various new kinds of, instead of Hindus and Muslims and Muslim oppression and Hindu resistance, etc., the class question of peasantry came in. The question of zamindars came in. That was analyzed. The structures, their social and economic structures were analyzed, and their relationship with one another were analyzed, and their impact on society, etc. And Irfan Habib's magnificent thesis, which is naturally open to several criticism, but nonetheless magnificent initial thesis that is not glorifying the Mughal ruler, but actually, in a way, if one likes to call it, damning the Mughal ruler, Mughal state, for being so oppressive toward the peasantry, that the peasantry had to, so impoverish the peasantry, that the peasantry had to revolt against the Mughal Empire and bring it crashing down. So that new ways of looking at history suddenly began to emerge, and they had great influence in the history writing. But class instead of religion. But by 1980s and certainly by 1990s, Marxism was itself in a bit of a crisis, under a strain. Marxist theory itself was under strain. Marxist practice was under a strain. And the Soviet Union had collapsed, and China was going its own, calling itself communist, but actually going its own way towards a, capitalist path, and so on and so forth. So that both Marxist theory and Marxist practice, as a kind of example, they were under great strain. But more than that, as this door opened with the Marxist opened a new door to the study of history, Indian history. This door wasn't shut after that. The door, more and more doors kept open, kept going on open, so that ever new themes began to emerge. Marvelous themes began to emerge. Marvelous new databases began to emerge. Irfan Habib's work, great masterly work, was, for example, written basically on the basis of Persian texts and travelers' accounts, European travelers' accounts, and so on, and texts and documents and so on. But new kinds of databases, literature as a not merely as a source of history, but literature itself as a history, literature as history, paintings they illustrate history, or depict, they convey a notion of history. Religious sects, new religious sects were emerging, or old religious sects were developing new branches or new ways of worship and so on and so forth. How were they emerging? What was happening in society which were giving rise to new sects and so on and so forth, Or the history of ecology, history of rains and forests, history of migrations. Migrations has been a phenomenon of human history right from as far as you can go, from centuries BC, several centuries BC. So that migrations, migrations all over, not in any particular part of the world, but all over, from all over to all over, migrations, or women's history, or gender history, or Dalit history, history of the marginal groups in society, or history of interpersonal relations within the household. All of these are fascinating new themes which have emerged, and new perspectives which have emerged beyond the Marxist perspective. Marxism gave us new light on some aspects of history, but it didn't have the theoretical equipment to go on further, to tackle, to handle these new kinds of themes that were emerging. So that new ways of looking at history with new databases emerging, new notions of time, for example, the new notions of or history of the notions of time, not one notion but several notions of time, history of space, history of science or sciences, etc., etc. I mean, one can go on and on and on. The 1990s and 2000s and the 21st century, they have been a magnificent, it has been a mind-blowing kind of opening up of the discipline of history in India, and decimating almost, not almost, totally decimating the colonial historiography that we had inherited for more than 200 years. So that a major change has taken place. But sadly, this major change in decolonization, and not as a by way of setting up the agenda of today we'll decolonize this and tomorrow we'll decolonize that aspect, but the very inner evolution of the inner dynamic of the discipline itself is leading us to newer and newer themes, newer branches, newer methods, newer perspectives, newer databases, etc., going on relentlessly, unstoppably. But, and I have to conclude here rather sadly, that, the present regime here is determined to see that we forget all about these magnificent new developments which have taken place in the discipline of history in India. The magnificent expansion of the discipline, of the space of history, and of every aspect of history that has taken place, mainly through the efforts of Indian historians, also other historians outside India, but mainly through them. And irrespective of whether it's Indian historians or outside historians, nonetheless, the magnificent expansion of the discipline of history in India that has taken place, the present regime wants us to forget all of this and go back to the James Mill kind of history of India, where religion is the only sort of explanatory, only driving force of all historical explanation. Go back to history, go back to that kind of history which James Mill had, colonial kind of history that James Mill had taught us. James Mill and other colonialists have taught us. And therefore, it seems to me a very classical case of divide and rule, which the British were accused of and rightly accused of following. It's a very, and the divide and rule took place on the basis of division between Hindus and Muslims, and of course castes, but mainly Hindus and Muslims, which led to partition. That divide and rule policy is a classical classical form is being replicated here as a state policy, as it were. And therefore, the tragedy of it is that all of it is being done in the name of decolonization. The regime talks of decolonization, but actually is recolonizing history writing. But let me not end on this sad note. Let me quite happily, let me say that, and I'm not being deliberately optimistic, but genuinely, that, having said that, the regime is trying to take us back to James Mill kind of history. Let me say that history as a discipline, in terms of students of history, teachers of history, researchers of history, they have not been affected by this kind of reversal to James Mill. They are not going back to those kinds of themes, which James Mill had proposed to us and which had been practiced right up to independence, pre-independence or independence period. They are not, history has gone far too beyond the reach of those kinds of themes and problematics, Hindu and Muslim and so on and so forth. They've gone, as I mentioned, some of these themes. Where do you find Hindu and Muslim in the history of ecology? Where do you find Hindu and Muslim in the migrations that were taking place around the whole world, and in different periods and for different reasons, and so on and so forth. So history has gone beyond those categories, and therefore, at a professional level, history is not in the danger of being overwhelmed, and therefore the regime knows about it, and therefore they are not bothered about what's happening to history as a discipline at the university level and the research level. They are bothered only about they are changing. They are taking us back to colonialist kind of history only at the school level, where school children, they leave their 10th class or 12th class after imbibing that kind of history, and among them maybe 1 or 2% will become professional historians, professional students of history and historians later on. Other 95-98% will carry with that kind of impression of history with them, and that is the kind of constituency that is being built up. Not the history as a discipline, but history as a base of creating this divide and rule policy. Well, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I hope, well, there is a concluding remarks. I hope there are questions also.
Yes, after concluding remarks by Professor Bodh Prakash, we'll come to question and answer session. Thank you very much, Professor Mukhia. It was very enlightening. Let's first hear Bodh Prakash ji, and then we come back to question and answer session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Razi Saab, and thank you, Professor Mukhia, for a wonderful lecture on the various, on the trajectory of history as a discipline. From the evolution of history from the universal models to more diverse kinds of histories, the requirement of proof, the evolution of archives and sources during and periodization. You took us through a wonderful journey of how history actually evolves and comes to sort of crystallize as a proper discipline only by the 19th century, where we are looking at not just stories, not just sort of myths or things based on popular beliefs, but history requiring some element of proof or evidence for it to function. History as a collection of all facts, what really happened. This is of course, and history as a science in that sense of the term. So my only question is that of course, as a scientific discipline, I mean, there is much to be said about it. But history has been, of course, as we all know, used and misused for various purposes, and the present regime is constantly doing this. So when we talk about history as something that really happened, how far can we really achieve that goal? Because, very often it is a matter of which particular aspect you wish to highlight and which you do not wish to highlight. How do you see the connection between this? So I'm reminded actually of a statement made by this very eminent lawyer, Faizan Mustafa, who was recently sort of on television discussing this whole debate on the Babri Masjid and now the Gyan Vapi mosque, which has become so very uh, so much in the news at the moment. And what Faizan Mustafa said was that, if there are if these things are going to be decided by the courts, then we are not going to reach very far. These issues or these conflicts have to be decided through mutual accommodation between communities. Now, I'm not a historian professionally. I'm not a historian. I am more of a cultural affairs person from literature, really. But I think that we need to also look at history in the context of some of the problems and conflicts that are plaguing us in the present times, and see what kind of a role history can play in those contexts. So my submission is that what really happened may not really work sometimes. Though as professional historians, of course, I'm sure that you are required to sort of explore many aspects which in the sense of what role can history play in society at large, because history is no longer confined to the domain of historians and professional historians, because now everybody, Mukhia Sahab, you will agree, everybody claims to be a
Yes,
historian of some sort or
sure.
the other. So,
Yeah.
so historians somewhere have to come back and claim their own that space, and sort of intervene in these larger political and cultural debates which are fragmenting society. Uh, the issue of course, the idea that I think that I was particularly sort of impressed and completely agree with Mukhia Saab, that the present regime wants to, in fact, in the name of decolonization, it is actually propagating a very colonial notion of history. This is absolutely correct, because the whole idea of religion as a category which can be, as an analytical category which can be used to explain events in history and the movement of historical events, is something that goes back to James Mill and colonial historiography. But and in that sense, therefore, I thought that one of the important things that we need to consider is this concept of the nation, because somewhere decolonization, the creation of a nation state, and the whole notion of what is a nation, who constitutes it, who does it belong to, these ideas are also sort of connected to the past, connected to the history of the
Sure.
past. and
Sure.
and unless we engage with this, it is not I mean, we have to engage with this on that in on that terrain, because a word anti-national that we constantly keep on hearing, which is directed against anybody who questions a certain version of history, this term actually should is best is most appropriate for the present proponents of that kind of colonial history. They are the real anti-nationals, because they are
Right.
arguing against the notion of a nation at all. So while I sort of sort of really admired your overview of this entire evolution of the discipline of history, and particularly, you mentioned class, and then you mentioned gender, and but also caste. And
Sure.
caste also has become very important in the way we write history and the way we understand history, and of course ecology and environment. These are very exciting new areas. But again, I would like to. This is just a question which I would like to raise. I mean, I'm sure there will be other questions, Mukhia Sahab, that when we look at sources like literature or painting or other sources which are not purely, in that sense, purely historical sources or archival sources in that sense, how would you, how would you sort of compare these sources with other more traditional archival sources or the written document in that sense? That is one kind of question which I would like to raise. And finally, of course, the issue of language also. I think that when you look at our past, when we look at, for instance, pre-colonial past, there is a history of course, contestation. But there is also a history of accommodation, of assimilation, of mutual understanding. And I think that we can perhaps learn something from there, which would make, maybe which would inspire us in the present context, because again, the issue of language and religion, these are very, very seminal issues in the present context. We have heard very recently, and this is the present regime, of course, has been trying to do it. This idea of Hindi, for instance, as something which should be accepted as quote unquote a national language. Now, we know from our history in South Asia what happens when you try to impose a language. We know that what happened when Urdu was sought to be imposed in what was then East Pakistan, and we know what has happened with the imposition of Sinhalese in Sri Lanka. It is a very, very sort of very critical issue in terms of how society can be sort of completely blown apart on this question. And so when the present regime talks about imposing Hindi as a national language in a multilinguistic society, in a society in which we have 22 official languages or 24 and many more which are not listed there, uh, this actually goes back to the debate in the Constituent Assembly in the 1950s, when there were people who said that Hindi must be made the national language. And very fortunately, we had sensible heads which sort of managed to avert that crisis. The whole nation can blow up on this question. We have seen how the language riots happened in the 1960s when there was a return to this question of a national language. And again, the BJP is doing exactly the same thing. So I think that we need to sort of talk a little bit more about nation and how we understand the nation, both in modern terms as well as how this nation idea of the nation gets
Sure.
connected to ideas of pre-colonial history, medieval, from the medieval and the ancient times. So thank you very much for this opportunity and this wonderful lecture, Professor Mukhia. I'm sure there will be many, many more questions. Thank you, Razisa.
I hope that.
Thank you, Boji, and thank you all speakers. And now we move to question and answer session. Today, none of our two moderators are present, and I'm not a very computer savvy person. So today I'm taking over all this, and I'll call people. If I see you can raise hand digitally, or if you cannot do the digital hand, then raise your hand, wave, I can see them. And I will ask one by one. I request everyone to be brief, not make statements, single question and only one question so that others can get time. The first hand that I see is Mr. Satyanath Chaudhary. Satyanath Chaudhary ji, be very brief and just ask a question.
Can I raise the first question first?
Of course. Of course.
Yeah. No, before Chaudhary comes in, let me just comment on Professor Bodh Prakash's very generous comments, observations. Thank you very much. Let me very quickly say that I agree with most of what you are saying. All of these are very significant issues, and we can't brush them aside. Question of language, question of nation, the question of, how nations are formed, etc., caste, and so on. But, I just concluded with Leopold von Ranke's understanding of history. History tells us as it really happened, This, he had pronounced this judgment in 1824. Since then, later in the 19th century, but particularly in the 20th century, there were lots of modifications or qualifications were introduced into this. And today, let me very quickly say that today nobody believes that history will tell us as it really happened. History can never tell us that it really happened, because a large part of history has already been destroyed. It gets destroyed every day. It gets destroyed, and also because history, recapturing history is not really one man job or one team job, but it's whole society's job in a way. I had earlier on mentioned that memory is also a part of history. Memory as a social memory, you see, of which mythologies are also a part of that. So history is far more complex than merely going and finding out from the archives what is the truth. There is no one objective truth. There are many truths which are hidden in archives and elsewhere outside the archives. So history doesn't tell you as it really happened, but what history does do is it makes us understand how societies change over time. That's its one crucial job, and therefore, in order to understand change, one has to understand the past. And B, it legitimizes, whether it legitimizes the regime, any regime, current or past regime, any regime, every regime seeks legitimacy from its construction of history, or it legitimizes challenges to the regime. Others who challenge the regime, they also fall back upon their understanding of history too. So, history is a far more complex phenomenon than Leopold Ranke had said. History tells you that it really happened. It's very simple, History doesn't really tell you as it really happened. But yeah, let's go on to Mr.
All right.
Chaudhary.
So, Mr.
Yes.
Satyanath, please ask.
Yes, and thank you very much, Professor Mukhia ji. I really enjoyed your presentation of, say, history of history. So, yeah, but please forgive me for asking you something, not so much about history of history, but I'm intrigued, and I have not found really reliable answer from other historians about how Dr. Ambedkar managed to become chairperson of the drafting committee of the Constitution. I mean, Congress was bent upon not letting him into the Constituent Assembly. I think, please correct me if I'm wrong. Patel is supposed to have mentioned to some people that he has not only closed the door for Dr. Ambedkar to get into Constituent Assembly, but even all the windows. And then he had to be invited by one Mr. Mandal.
Let's hear from him. Let's hear from him. Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, actually, Mr. Chaudhary, first, it's a question far outside what I was speaking. But anyway, Congress, you are looking at Congress as one single whole. It was never one single whole. You see, it was always a constituent of many parts, contradictory parts with each other, you see. So that, there are many pulls and pressures of various kinds at some level, some stage. Ambedkar is run down as a kind of, almost an outcast. At some stage, through other pulls and pressures and so on and so forth, he's brought back to such a high position as being the. So, you have to look at the inner kinds of conflicts and struggles and compromises within the Congress to look at the life of either Ambedkar, or for that matter anybody else, whether it's Nehru or it is Subhash Bose or it is anybody else. So I think don't just look at one. Congress has one sort of identity. Congress has many identities. Yeah, let's hear the next question.
Thank you. Anybody else who wants to raise a question? So that is, I do not know if there are not hands risen, then I will ask people to make comments or ask questions.
Yes.
And I'll invite Dr. Nazir Ahmed.
I'll be very sad if there are no questions, actually. But anyway,
That,
your choice.
yeah,
Yes.
Nazir sir. Okay.
Got it.
All right.
Okay. Yeah, आदाब अर्ज़ है प्रोफेसर साहब.
Adab.
मेरे सवाल के दो पहलू हैं. Two aspects of my question. One relates to Ibn Khaldun. Perhaps it was an oversight, the contribution of Ibn Khaldun to historiography. Widely recognized, universally recognized as the father of history. Even people such as President Reagan recognized it. You may wish to make a comment, who in turn rode on a galaxy of other empirical historians. The second part of my question has to do with the contribution of historians in India itself. For instance, Barani. What I find most fascinating about Barani is not that the fact that he documented things, but he considered the confluence of ideas. For instance, in 1328, there was a magnificent court of Ghiyasuddin Taghlaq. There was a court martial of Chiragh Delhi.
Sorry, sorry.
That's
1328, it was Muhammad Tughlaq who had come to the throne, I think.
It was 1 year before, sir. It was 1 year before he ascended the throne. This is when the court martial took
1324. Okay.
34, yes. Pardon me for days, my age.
Okay, yeah.
I'm 83 years old.
So am I.
Okay. So that aspect of it also needs to be paid attention to.
Yes.
Namely, he considered, for instance, the positions that were offered by the Sufis and the Mutazilites and the establishment Khazis, and how he sorted out the ideas as charting out a possible path to the future of the then India also needs to be considered. Some comments, sir.
Yes. Well, thank you very much, Nazir Sahab. Nazir Sahab, number one, it wasn't an oversight about Ibn Khaldun. You know, I just made about four or five sentences about the Arab Islamic history. I wasn't discussing. Please invite me for another lecture on Islamic history, the history of Islamic history itself. You know, I'll give you very, very detailed lecture on whether it is Ibn Khaldun or At-Tabari and many others. You know, so that I have studied them in great detail. So I was just sort of making very quick comments about European history, Arab Muslim history, Indian history. I avoided comments about Chinese and Japanese history because, you know, I was given 40 to 45 minutes, naturally. So that is, there was no oversight, you know, except that, in fact, I was pointing out that long before the Europeans had thought of finding proof for their or authenticate their narration of events, the Arab Muslims had already, the chronology I mentioned was one very strong mode of authenticating events, you know, which was discovered long before the Europeans had, you know. So I was anyway pointing out that we don't owe all history merely to Europeans. We also owe history to other sources like Arab Muslims and so on and so forth. So I wasn't really counting at At-Tabari and Ibn Khaldun and Ziauddin Barni and so on and so forth. You know, if you like, I have a whole book that Professor Nasreen had mentioned, My first book is called Historians and Historiography During the Reign of Akbar, though it starts with the historians of Delhi Sultanate, including Ziauddin Barni. But anyway, that's so you know, it was only for reasons of brevity that I just made a few comments about Arab Muslim historiography. And about Ziauddin Barni, once again, if one can give a whole lecture on Ziauddin Barni. But you know, Ziauddin Barni was a very eminent historian of the Delhi Sultanate, not merely because he narrated events, you know, but he gave a meaning to those. He was very conscious of giving meaning to those events. And he was constantly driving your attention to the meanings embedded in what he was saying. You know, he says, these are his words, history teaches some lessons, and it is for the historian to find those lessons. So he's not merely a narrator of historical events, he's a historian himself in the true sense of the, except that, you know, although there was no notion of finding proof, etc., for Ziauddin Barni, but he was still, it's very remarkable that even then his the events, not only the events that he narrated, but even the details that he has given, for example, of the market system of Alauddin Khilji, are very authentic. They have been authenticated by modern historians like Irfan Habib, you know. So yeah, he is a very remarkable historian. But then if you want me to speak about either Ibn Khaldun or Ziauddin Barni, then you'll have to invite me to
we will
another.
consider, yeah, we will consider certainly. Let's move on
Yes.
the other questions. Mr.
Yes,
Daya, please unmute yourself. Daya Saab, Mr. Daya.
Yes.
Yes, please. Go ahead.
Professor, in talking about colonial period of history in India, you still mentioned about the three divisions of ancient, modern, and medieval, and identified the ancient with Hindu and medieval with Islam. But did the British historians identify the modern as Christian when there was no Christianity here?
Yes.
Not enough.
No, they did not. This was James Mill's division, Hindu period, Muslim period, British period. You know. Prior to that, as I mentioned, there was no division of historical time in any region of anywhere in the world in history. You know, Europe had started developing, but nowhere else did have any division of any identity of this period with that either religion or dynasty or whatever. So it's a James Mill's gift to us. You know. Now, why did he not use Hindu period, Muslim period, British period? I'm sorry, Christian period. That would have been the very logical succession of the periods. See, according to his logic, that is, not according to my and your logic. It would have. He did not, because he was making a point. He was making the point by dividing it such that Hindu period and Muslim period, that is to say pre-British period, these are backward periods of backwardness, you know, total backwardness, dark periods, you know, of periods when whole societies and whole polities are driven by religion, nothing else. You know, reason doesn't enter their heads. Reason doesn't enter their society. You see, Indian society at all, either in the ancient period or Hindu period or British or Muslim period, because he was a utilitarian and he had really contempt for all religions. You know, he stood for what he thought was reason and progress and so on and so forth. You know, so religion is counter according to him, is counter to progress, counter to religion, counter to reason, rationality. So what he was really saying was that Hindus and Muslims had kept India backward, irrational. Now the British have come and they will modernize India. They will put India onto the secular path. He wasn't using the word secular and so on and so forth, nor was it necessary. He was put India to the rational path of progress. So that's why he used the word British period. The British emphasized the modernity of the rule and rationality of the rule, in contrast to the Hindu and the Muslim period. That's why I called it Hindu period, Muslim period, and British period. But let me say that this notion that India was very backward until the British, until colonialism came and unleashed India's progress and broke the shackles of backwardness, religious backwardness, etc., and unleashed the progress that was inherent in Indian society. It was the gift of colonial rule in India, and this was not common to James Mill. It was common throughout the 19th century. James Mill was a small scale intellectual. Great intellectuals like Hegel and Marx. Marx's famous statement: "India has no history." Hindus have no history. They called India, they identified India and Hindus, but that's only not in religious terms, but as a generally spoken term. Hindus have no history, and it is the British who release the energies of India to go on to the path, etc., etc. It was a very painful release. It caused India quite a lot. He sympathizes with India, but he still insists that India was released onto the path of progress only by colonialism. Until colonialism, all of the notion of Orientalism or Oriental society, Occidental or Oriental, the notion of Asiatic mode of production. There is a European mode of production which keeps on progressing from one stage to another, from slavery to primitive communism, to slavery, to feudalism, to capitalism, and it will go on to socialism. It's constantly progressive from one stage to another. And it's a state of progress, the idea of progress. But there is the exceptional region, the Orient. Orient has the what's called Asiatic mode of production, which doesn't change at all, because there are no classes, and therefore there are no class conflicts, and therefore there is no progress, and so on and so forth. So it was a common belief among European philosophers, great ones of them, not merely. So that's why he used the term British, following Hindu and Muslim rather than Christian.
All right.
Thank you.
Now
Thank you.
there is a question from Professor David Lelivel, I think, or
comment. Oh, okay. Hello, David.
Hello. Pleasure to hear you and see you, at least virtually. And I very much enjoyed your talk. I wanted to go back to the start of your talk, in which you spoke about scientific history, and you mentioned Rank and the use of evidence. And of course, that doesn't apply to James Mill. James Mill had no evidence whatsoever to speak of. And what really we came to talk about, your talk emphasized, and I think what was most interested, is how history in some grand theoretical scheme is laid out. And in that sense, I wouldn't say that James Mill represents a modern concept of history as opposed to Farishta or Ibn Khaldun or so on. These are and Farishta and Ibn Khaldun were, even from that point of view, better historians than James Mill was. The interesting thing that your talk suggested to me, and this is a long discussion, is what are the units of analysis? And you mentioned the differences between ecological history and family history and all of that. These are different things. We are bound into national histories as a product of the nation state, and the way the past, I won't call it history, the past is used to construct. And I listened, forgive me, to Modi's speech on Independence Day before the Red Fort, which was an attempt to write out a scheme of the whole of Indian history in which Muslims did not appear at all.
No.
Actually, he mentioned by mistake, I think, one Muslim, Hazrat Mahal from the 1857. His speechwriter probably got fired after that one. But you know, this is history. The past is ideology, which is very different from what you do and what and I think Professor Nasreen made a very good point in introducing you, that you have tried to go from academic scholarly history into wider audiences back when you were a writer of the famous textbook with Ramataba and Bipin Chandra, you know, that this was an attempt to reach out to the larger audiences. But history as science, as opposed to the stories that people tell, is an academic field after all. It's as is physics and biology and all the other things, and I'm afraid is specialized and not particularly available, and it's hard to make it available to people.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much. I think when I spoke of Ranke's history, history tells you as it really happened, as science. He called it science, history as a science. And in fact, the whole of the 19th century was looking at all these disciplines as sciences. Economics as science, politics is still called political science, and so on and so forth, history as science. So they were actually not only comparing, but almost, if you like, elevating all of these social science disciplines. In fact, the term social science or social sciences itself has its origins and so on and so forth. The attempt to equate all of these with the natural sciences, you know, and therefore an element of elevation is implicit in this. But you know, it is not really, history is not, or social sciences or philosophy or literature, they are not sciences in the sense in which physics and chemistry, etc., are exact sciences. You know? They cannot be, because Ranke may call it science, others may call it science, but you know, and they might think that someday, you see, his assumption was that, as I mentioned earlier, that one day all the details of history, all the facts of history will have been collected, not assessed. Your assessment of these facts comes only after they have been collected, you know, not before that, you see. Don't evaluate them, don't judge them. Just go on collecting facts. Now, this is, anyway, it didn't occur to Ranke, probably didn't occur to his successors of scientific history either, that, you know, all the facts can never be collected. You know, it can never happen that all the facts will have been collected any day, you know, today or in the 31st century, on the 41st century, all the facts can never be collected, you know, partly because many of these facts have been destroyed and they are getting destroyed, partly because it's not, you know, history doesn't advance by collecting facts, more and more facts. History also advances by, or like any other discipline, by self-questioning, you know, questioning the old sort of assumptions that you have made, old conclusions that you have made, reached, and so on and so forth. So you question yourself constantly, and therefore the search for history can never end, you know. I mean, Ranke's assumption that all facts will be collected and therefore the search for history will end someday, you know, it can never end. It can never end because you keep on questioning yourself all the time. Historians keep questioning not only each other, but themselves all the time. But, you know, so it can never be science because the databases of science are nearly objective, but the databases of social sciences are all human-made, you know, whether it is history or it is sociology or it is economics. These are all human-made, human-generated databases, you know, and therefore they can never be as objective as the databases of sciences are. The databases of sciences are nature given. Nature gives us the distance between the earth and the moon and the earth and the sun. We can't change that, Nature gives us the shape of the earth, which can't change that. But so that these are given to us, by extraneous agency. But all the facts of history, or data of history and social sciences, are human made. They are made by human, they are recorded by humans, and they are interpreted, studied and interpreted by humans. So that we can never reach the kinds of conclusions that either make those kinds of experiments or reach those kinds of conclusions that scientists can ever make. And therefore, my assumption is that my sort of understanding is that history can never be, let's call it scientific for our own pleasure, but it can never be a science like physics or chemistry or whatever, because the nature of the databases of these are very, very different.
All right.
But
So, yeah. So let's move to,
Okay.
I'm asking Professor Aditya Mukherjee if he is still here.
Okay, he's also there.
Yeah, he is here, at least name shows. Aditya ji, where are you? Oh, yeah. Hello.
Hello, Aditya, where are you?
He is here, but I don't know. I can see his name. He was here all along.
Well, if you can't locate him, okay.
Yeah, maybe he will come again. Dr. Abdul Jabbar, if you want to like to make comment or ask question. Yeah, unmute yourself. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Thank you. It's a great lesson, great presentation to understand the whole origin of history. You started with the theology, transition for theology to human agency in terms of histories. Hadith was part of your discussion a little bit, because Hadith authentication by people coming into Saudi Arabia, trying to understand the life of the Prophet, and then how they connected his life lessons to the Quran versus the Quran. So clearly, this is also interlinked with the religious tradition too. So it's not alone the human agency, it's also the theology imbibed into this conversation. So can you comment on that?
Well, actually, I have commented on this.
I see.
That history came with Islam to the Arab Muslim world. Prior to that, there was no notion of history in this part of the world. You see, as one Syrian historian of the Arabs has said, Tarif Khalidi is his name. He says Islam gave a new religion to the world and a new concept of history, you see. So history did come with Islam, and I mentioned that history closely, and therefore is closely connected with Islam, And yet I tried to, and yet, it was argued long ago by one late historian, Peter Hardy, that he wrote a book, small book called Historians of Medieval India. In 1960, I think it was published, very long ago, where he argued that history for medieval Indian historians, history is a branch of theology, just like Europe. He was just copying, the European sort of, notion of history. And he asserted that history for medieval Indian historians was a branch of theology. I have tried to argue earlier, and I've tried to argue now, today, that although it is connected with Islam very closely, in fact, all historians except one or two, Abul Fazl here, and what's his name in Iran, they except these two historians, every historian in whichever part of the Muslim world uses Hijri as the chronological framework, invariably. See, Abul Fazl doesn't use Hijri. He uses the word I'm sorry, the era of Ilahi era, or Akbar's Ilahi era, but not Hijri. And I'm forgetting his name, the Iranian historian. Anyway, here they are the only two who don't use Hijri chronology, only everybody else does. And their notion of history is also, in a way, copying. I'm talking of the context of India, copying the Islamic notion of history. You see, Islamic notion of history is that prior to the coming of Islam, there was jahiliya, there was ignorance and savagery everywhere. You see, it is Islam which brought knowledge and so on and so forth. And therefore, the medieval historians of India, when they write history, except once again Abul Fazl as a major exception. There are some others also minor exceptions, but major exceptions. Except for him, nobody else goes to the history of India prior to the establishment of the so-called Muslim rule. See, they all begin with the coming of either Muhammad Ghari or Mahmud of Ghazni, or whatever, or established. Ziauddin Barni begins with the establishment of Delhi Sultanate and so on and so forth. So that prior to that, history doesn't interest anyone because it is the age of Jahiliya. Except Abul Fazl, who goes right deep into the history and mythology and literature and astrology of the Hindus long before he even gives you the exact date, years, 4,973 years and 6 months and 3 days or something of this sort of the Mahabharata, that kind of calculation of, so that he is one who is an exception, but most others in a way are replicating this notion of history as the age of Jahiliya and the age of but I'm not using the word enlightenment because it has European connotations, but the age of coming to knowledge, etc., coming of knowledge, etc. So there is a great deal, and the constant invocation of Islam in their, Allah Alam, God knows, Allah knows best, etc., etc. All that is there, but my basic distinction still was that even after this, it doesn't become part of Islamic theology, unlike Peter Hardy, because of the two reasons I gave. It's individual events rather than collective events at one narration. When God causes historical events, he is not causing them haphazard. In his mind, they are not haphazard. They are part of a pattern, past, present, and future. But therefore, a united kind of pattern is occurring when the historical events are taking place, not in the historian's mind, but in God's mind. And that God's will, when you say Alauddin Khalji was a very brave ruler and he went and conquered so much of territory, and Firoz Tughlaq was a very weak ruler. He was cowardly and he sat at home and didn't conquer any territory. What are you attributing this conquest to? God's will or to Alauddin Khilji's will or Firoz Tughlaq's lack of will, you see? So that they are attributing it to their will, their determination, their decision, or for that matter, their nature, see, human will. So that's why I said that although it is connected to Islam, very deeply connected to Islam, closely connected to Islam, it still doesn't become part of Islamic theology. That was my argument. Okay.
Thank you. Great. Thank you. Thank you very much.
I see Professor Suchita Mahajan also. I do not know whether, and I ask her to unmute herself and raise any question or comments. Suchita ji, are you here?
Sucheta and Aditya were my colleagues. They have been hearing me for the last 40 years.
That's why they
tired of...
No. Razi Saab, I have enjoyed the lecture.
All right.
And I have no questions. I have only wanted to congratulate Professor Mukhia on the lecture. Thank you so much.
So that's why I was saying that, you guys are hearing him.
You have heard me for 40 years.
All right. So I guess if
Okay.
there is no other question, then we can conclude this.
Your time is also up, actually. Yes.
It's quite late for you, sir. And the only danger point that I see is that although the historians are not changing their course at the higher level, but the textbooks in the middle school,
Yes.
high school,
Yes.
are corrupting and poisoning the minds of many Indians to change the
Yes.
whole thing.
Right.
And
right.
that is the real danger where we
That's the real
have to be
deal.
very
Absolutely.
concerned. So thank
Anyway,
you
thank
all.
you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you,
Thank you.
Farhat, Saba, and both Prakash ji, and hope that we will see
Thank you,
you
Razi.
guys again for another session on
Thank you.
Islamic history or something. So, hello everyone.
Inshallah.
Inshallah.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Good night. Good
Inshallah.
night.
Bye.
Yeah, this is the one word that really keeps the hope alive. Inshallah. All right. Thank you all.
Okay. Okay.
Okay.
Bye.
Khuda Hafiz. Namaste.
Khuda
Salam.
Hafiz. Khuda. Bye.